Okay, so hello everyone, and thank you for being here. My name is Paul D'Ambrosio, and I teach Chinese philosophy at East China Normal University in Shanghai, where the 四海为学 collaborative learning project is based. I want to welcome you to our 28th lecture and our 55th event. Today we are going to discuss Reframing Women in the Analects with Professor Erin Cline. And we have Dr. Liang Yuhan from Wuhan University, Professor Wang from the University of Hong Kong, and Professor Dimitra Amarantidou from the University of Macau, here to discuss this with Professor Cline. Our chair today is Agnė Veisaitė from the Chinese University of Hong Kong. It's become a tradition here at the 四海为学 Collaborative Learning Project to give younger scholars a chance to be part of high-profile academic events by inviting them to take part as chairs or discussants. So if there are any younger scholars in the audience who wish to be part of future events, please email me. Our event tonight will be 90 minutes, ending promptly at 9:30 p.m. Beijing time. Before getting things started and handing them over to Agnė, I just want to say a few things about the 四海为学 Collaborative Learning Academic Forum. The 四海为学 Collaborative Learning Project hopes to distinguish itself from some of the less productive conventional practices in contemporary Chinese academia. As posted on our website, we are not interested in male peacocks, in jerks, or in any form of egoism or self-promotion. We hope to curb all types of aggressive and "look at me, I'm smarter than you," or "don't I know so much," and similar attitudes sometimes found in academic exchanges. We might even go so far as to say that we hope to be somewhat of a counterbalance to the negative attitudes often found in blind reviews. While there is certainly a time and a place for anonymity, or at least the appearance of anonymity, communication in academia should have just as much time and place for speaking to one another on more congenial and community-forming settings. The neologism 四海为学, which was created by Robin Wang, is a play on 四海为家, and we hope to keep this idea at the foreground of all of our events. The 四海为学 Collaborative Learning Project seeks to accomplish these shifts in orientation during academic exchange by encouraging productive communication, humble discussions, real questions, and responses that are open and honest. So we hope to foster environments where people can truly learn from and with one another. So before introducing our chair, I want to once again thank Professors Erin Cline, Liang Yuhan, Wang, and Dimitra for being with us here today. So our chair is Agnė Veisaitė. She earned her master's degree from Peking University and is currently pursuing her PhD in philosophy at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. Her research focuses on early Taoism and comparative philosophy, and her thesis aims to explore the role of imagination and the philosophy of nature in the Zhuangzi. We're very happy to have you here, Agnė. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction and for the invitation to be here. I can only add to the comments before that I also use your work, Professor Cline, in my own research, and I'm really pleased to have a chance to introduce your talk on Reframing Women in the Analects. So Professor Cline is the Paul and Chandler Tanglabu Distinguished Professor in Interfaith Studies and Dialogue at Georgetown University, and also Senior Research Fellow in the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. She's the author of 5 books and various articles on Chinese and comparative philosophy, and her most recent books include Little Sprouts and the Tao of Parenting, Asian Chinese Philosophy and the Art of Raising Mindful, Resilient, and Compassionate Kids, and also The Analects, a Guide, published by the Oxford University Press in 2022. And Professor Cline also recently completed her new translation on the Confucian Analects, the Lunyu, which is forthcoming in 2026, and I'm very much looking forward to that. And besides her research, she also teaches Chinese philosophy, Chinese religions, comparative philosophy, and theology at Georgetown University. So welcome, Professor Cline, and very much looking forward to your talk.
Thank you so much. And I want to thank all of you for being a part of this, for the wonderful introductions. And I'm delighted to have an opportunity to have such a conversation among friends and colleagues. And I have always benefited from these kinds of conversations. So what I'm going to do today is talk from a couple pieces of work, some of the work that I've done as I've worked on my translation of the Analects, some of the previous work that I've done on women in the Analects, and sort of weave some of these pieces together. Exploring the theme of women in the Analects has been something that it's been an ongoing project of mine, and kind of fun because I've bumped into lots of different sources. And then one of the things that I am always thinking through is what do we do when we sort of lay all these different sources out together and think about the story that is told about particular individuals as a whole, which is one of the things that the Confucian tradition does as a whole when it looks at different people and remembers different people. So you'll kind of see me kind of wrangling with the text and trying to understand some of these things, and I look forward to our conversation afterward. I think it's a really, people often talk about the patriarchal dimensions of the Analects, and I always think it's interesting to try to zero in on what exactly are the patriarchal dimensions of the text, and there's a lot that can be said there. So, I mean, early Chinese culture was undoubtedly patriarchal. I mean, seen, for example, in the fact that none of Kong's disciples were women, no women were rulers. A lot of sources document the fact that early Confucians viewed women as full moral agents, though, capable of Confucian moral self-cultivation, including participation in rituals. And there's been wonderful work done on this by scholars like Lisa Raffles and Ann Kinney, seen in a number of different texts, collected biographies of women, the Liang Yuhan, and other texts as well. Those sources don't always depict women as fully subordinate to men or as completely inferior to them. It really is only in later Confucian sources and in later commentaries on the Analects that we find the most deeply misogynistic views, including views that regard women solely as sexual temptresses, objects of beauty, or whose only source of worth is their ability to bear sons. Many of the later commentaries on the Analects both amplified existing misogynistic views, such as those that prevented women from being disciples of teachers like Kongzi, and in addition, offered new and deeply patriarchal readings of the text. So there are a couple different things going on there, I think. It's my argument that these amplifications and new interpretations reflect later views of women and not those found in the text of the Analects. In fact, the Analects, as well as other early sources, suggests that Kongzi might have been responding critically to, at least in some ways, or at least not fully accepting some of the misogynistic views of his time. Now, the Analects says very little about women explicitly, right? And there's only one named woman in the Analects, and that is Nanzi, the wife of Duke Ling of Wei. And she's the person that I want to focus on, especially today, as well as this wide range of other figures in her story, which is, I think, a really fascinating story. Duke Ling of Wei, Nanzi's husband, reigned from 534 to 493 BCE. And Analects 628 tells us, the master visited Nanzi. Zilu was unhappy about it. The master swore an oath to him, saying, if I've done anything wrong, may Tian repudiate me, may Tian repudiate me. So the passage is notable not just because it's the only passage that names a woman in the text, but also because of the religious appeal that's sort of central to it. Kongzi invites Tian, most often translated as heaven, this mysterious entity that he believes has sent him on a moral and religious mission to strike him down if he's done anything wrong by meeting with Nanzi. So in other words, Kongzi expresses the view that his student, Zilu, is wrong in disapproving of the meeting. But what was Zilu wrong about? Throughout the Confucian tradition, traditional commentaries and later interpreters have uniformly read this passage in the same way. They maintain that Nanzi was a woman of ill repute, an adulterer, and that this is why Zilu was unhappy about Kongzi meeting with her. So there's pretty unified reading of it, unlike many other passages. Several commentators suggest that Kongzi had to request an audience with the wife of rulers when arriving in any state, just as a matter of ritual propriety, and that this is why he defends himself. In my book, The Analects, a Guide, and also in my forthcoming translation of the Analects, I argue that the Confucian view of Nanzi, that she was an adulterer, really has no basis. And the traditional Confucian commentaries and also modern scholars have perpetuated this myth about her. I further argue that important features of her story have been neglected as a result of this myth, including the fact that her husband had one of the earliest documented and most well-known same-sex relationships in the Chinese tradition. This, I argue, offers really important insights into who Nanzi might have been and gives us good reasons to question traditional views about her. I also contend that what happened to her in the Confucian tradition makes an interesting comparison with the story of Mary Magdalene in the Christian tradition, and that the similar features of the two accounts are striking and prove instructive for understanding how traditions over time undermine the role of women by rewriting narratives and perpetuating falsehoods about them. In early Confucianism, women were valued in important respects, and their virtues were documented in some early texts, yet women were regularly marginalized and degraded by claims that they were sexual temptresses. Given that all of the Chinese texts that reference Nanzi's story, including the Analects and its commentaries, were written and controlled by men, I think it's fair to ask whether we have good reasons to think that Nanzi was, in fact, the woman of ill repute that the tradition paints her to be. So there are three Chinese texts that describe Nanzi's story in varying degrees of detail. One is the Zuozhuan, another is the Shiji, then we have the Liang. The Zuozhuan is the earliest of these, and of course, all these texts have different pieces written at different times. As we know, this is the body of literature we deal with in our field. Perhaps dating back to the 4th century BCE. The other two are Han Dynasty texts. Okay, so have we seen the Analects describes the aftermath of Nanzi's meeting with Kongzi, and traditional Confucian commentators on the Analects make sense of the passage in similar ways. There is one other text that discusses Nanzi's meeting with Kongzi, though. The Shiji offers a later account with more detail, saying that Nanzi invited Kongzi to visit her, telling him, "When Junzi from other lands honor our Lord with their friendship, they always pay a visit to me. This is why I would also like to meet you." The Shiji says that Kongzi declined at first, then was forced to comply, and that, quote, "the lady sat behind a linen curtain to receive him. Kongzi, entering, faced north, bowed below. She returned his bow from behind the curtain, and her jade pendants tinkled. Kongzi said later, 'I did not want to go, but once there, I had to conform to etiquette.'" So this version of the story is important as we read the Analects because it likely influenced commentators on the Analects, as they repeat almost verbatim what the Shiji says, pointing out that as a matter of ritual propriety, Kongzi likely had to request an audience with the wife or consort of the ruler when arriving in a state. So on this view, Kongzi was suppressing his personal disapproval of Nanzi and risking his reputation in order to follow the dictates of ritual. Other commentators suggest that Zilu's disapproval arises either from his suspicion that illicit activity may have occurred between Kongzi and Nanzi, or from his view that Kongzi was trying to gain a political advantage by seeing her, a view that also may have been influenced by the Shiji. But as we will see, a number of other sources inform the commentators' views of Nanzi, and this also complicates matters. So it's not an easy story to sort of pull apart the different threads. We have to move across different sources and try to understand where the commentators are pulling things from. The Liang, written by Liang, describes Nanzi as, quote, "one of two depraved women of Wei," the second one being Nanzi's daughter, actually, whom we'll discuss in just a moment. And this text states that when she was the wife of Duke Ling of Wei, she had an affair with Zijiao of Song, which the text says is also her home state. And when the heir apparent, Kwai, who may or may not have been her biological son, learned of it, quote, he became enraged with them. Nanze then slandered the heir apparent to Duke Ling by claiming that he wanted to kill her. Duke Ling was furious, and fearing his father's wrath, Kwai fled to Song. When Duke Ling died, he was still living in exile, and Duke Ling's and Kwai's son was placed on the throne, the grandson. Kwai's sister, Boji, the daughter of Nanze and Duke Ling, later conspired to have Kwai's son removed from the throne so that her brother could take power. And when he ascended the throne, he killed Nanze, right? So we're getting a very complicated story that's unfolding, and that really would make an incredible movie, I think, right? Or Taylor Swift song, as maybe a trilogy of Taylor Swift songs, as she's been known to do. So according to Liang Juan, Nanze's transgressions were adultery and slander, okay? But if we're to trust an earlier source, the Zuozhuan, then an important part of her story is left out of the Liang Juan. According to the Zuozhuan, Kwai really did originally intend to kill Nanze, and Nanze even witnessed him attempting to execute the plan to kill her, which is when she went and told her husband, the Duke. That would mean that she was not guilty of slandering Kwai to Duke Ling. What she reported was true. He had tried to kill her. Okay, so we were getting different pieces from different sources here. What about the allegation of adultery? It turns out that there are really a number of reasons to doubt the truth of this claim as well. To begin, it's unclear what exactly her relationship was to Song Chao. He's mentioned in Analects 6:16 as someone who is physically very attractive. Kongza says it's difficult to get by without good looks like his. Kongza likens his good looks to the glibness that others are known for. So for Kongza, these are superficial qualities as opposed to the things that we should really judge people's character by. One commentator on this passage says that Song Chao relied on his physical beauty in order to gain the affection of Nanze. The language here suggests that he may have initiated the relationship between them. It's always hard to tell, right? But quite significantly and unfortunately, the missionary translator James Legge states in his 1893 translation of the Analects that in 628, and this is the quote from Legge, Confucius vindicates himself for visiting the unworthy Nanze. Nanze was the wife of the Duke of Wei and the half-sister of the Prince of Chao, mentioned in chapter 14. Her lewd character was well known, and hence Zilu was displeased, thinking an interview with her was disgraceful to the master, end quote. The idea that Song Chao was Nanze's half-brother seems to originate with Legge, but he doesn't substantiate that claim for us. Which of course is significant. I mean, that would make her behavior all the more salacious. The text doesn't include any indication of that relationship. Nevertheless, again, unfortunately, Albert O'Hara in his 1978 translation of the Liang Juan perpetuates that myth, interpolating the word incestuous into his translation so that it reads, when she had incestuous relations with Song Chao. Anne Kinney, in her recent translation of the Liang Juan, correctly renders it illicit relations, refers to adultery. In addition to the fact that the text itself does not specify any relationship between Song Chao and Nanze, and given that it's not even clear whether Kwai was her biological son, it's hard to see how we would know that Song Chao was her half-brother. We don't find a basis for that in the text. Kinney says their exact relationship is just unclear, right? We've had a little bit of scholarship on this passage, not a lot of secondary scholarship. Siegfried Englert and Roderick Pitak argue that even the matter of whether Nanze was from Song is actually questionable when we look at all the historical sources. While Liu Xiang says that Nanze was a native of Song, none of the earlier sources that discuss her mention this. So surveying all of the sources, they conclude that there is no clear evidence of any direct family connection between Nanze and Song Chao, nor of any amorous relation between the two. They argue that Liu Xiang based his account on the Zuozhuan, but altered its content significantly. If they're correct, then the question of whether she committed adultery is even in question. And we seem to be confronted with a case in which unfounded rumors and speculation, together with derogatory views of women, which were widespread, have really driven the history of a woman's reputation. Further, the Zuozhuan, on which Xu Xiang seems to have relied, says that Duke Ling invited Song Chao to court to gratify his wife. Okay. Interesting language there, right? So since Duke Ling issued the invitation, it would seem strange if he had invited Song Chao with the aim of arranging for his wife to have an affair. But in order to explore that question in just a moment, I want to turn to the subject of Duke Ling and his biography as it's described in the sources that we have. When it comes to the matter of how Nanzi came to be so widely regarded as a woman of ill repute, there are some additional layers of the story that I think are also worth thinking about. According to the Zuozhuan, her son initially came to believe that she had an affair with Song Chao when he was returning home from a trip, and some passersby, some people who lived in the countryside in Song, started chiding him, kind of chanting at him, and they sang this little song, okay? And so it's kind of an odd scenario where they seem to be teasing him, poking fun at him, maybe his family. The chant, the sort of sing-song that they chant at him is, now that you've taken care of your randy sow, why not send home our handsome swine? So the text says that when he heard this, Nanzi's son, Kwai was ashamed. And it was after this incident that he planned to assassinate Nanzi. As Englert and Patak point out, the song is exceedingly difficult to translate, okay? Very cryptic. It's also difficult to interpret even once you've translated it, right? Once you kind of have a gloss on it. So according to later commentators, Kwai interpreted it as suggesting that Nanzi had had a sexual relationship with Song Chao. He was humiliated by this, and that's sort of what leads to the problem. It's not at all clear that we should simply follow Kwai's interpretation, right? Which led him to attempt to murder Nanzi and eventually to succeed in murdering her. To make matters worse, some commentaries on the Zuozhuan may have confused Nanzi with another woman. And this piece, I think, is extremely significant for how we read the text. There was a widow of another duke who did, it seems, from all the sources, have an affair with Song Chao. It's possible then that the claim that Nanzi had an affair with Song Chao was a case of mistaken identity, and that she was conflated with the wife of another duke who had the affair. In addition, Book 3 of the Liang, which contains stories of women who were sympathetic and wise. So this is one of the portions of the text that's celebrating women's virtues and documenting their lives and how they exemplified these virtues. That chapter contains a story about the wife of Duke Ling of Wei. Unlike most of the women in the Liang, she's unnamed, so we don't have a name for her. But it describes a woman who was clever and wise. And this story is, without question, a contrast to the story of Nanzi, as we know her, the wife of Duke Ling of Wei, that's described in Book 7, okay, which contains stories of women who were depraved and favored, okay? Commentators such as Ma Su, right, who was writing in the 1600s, state that the wife of Duke Ling of Wei described in Book 3 cannot be Nanzi, a conclusion that's in line with the widespread historical view that Nanzi was a woman of ill repute. Anne Kinney, as well, states that she thinks it's unlikely that the wife mentioned in this biography is Nanzi. But Englert and Patak argue that this story is indeed about Nanzi and that we have a case of mistaken identity here. They note that while Duke Ling is said to have had 3 wives, the most frequently used title in the sources for Nanzi is Fu Ren, his legal wife. Okay, so this is another difficult wrinkle. A few commentators pick up on these historical inconsistency and contradictions in the story across the sources. So, for instance, Gao Shiji, whose commentary on the Zuozhuan appeared in 1690, questioned how Kwai could have ever ascended the throne after murdering his father's wife, right? Whether or not she's his biological mother. But for the most part, it goes unquestioned. And when English language translators begin to work with the text, they unfortunately reinforced some of the inaccuracies. So we see this when Legg and O'Hara introduced the idea that Song Chao was Nanza's half-brother. And we see the momentum in the tradition when contemporary translators, even some, I think just some of the best translators and scholars, note Nanza's reputation. So for example, Burton Watson writes that she was notorious for her adulterous conduct. Ted Slingerland notes that she was the notoriously corrupt and decadent consort of Duke Ling. Roger Ames and Henry Rosemont write that she was the concubine of Duke Ling of Wei, who had a rather colorful and unseemly reputation. So all of these scholars are noting sort of the prevailing story in the tradition. And we can see there some of the inaccuracies that have been handed down and perpetuated over time in the original and then in English translation as well. But the Analects itself, of course, doesn't say that Nanza was a woman of ill repute. And even the commentators don't agree on why Zilu is unhappy with Kongza's behavior, although many of them clearly think he disapproves of Kongza associating with a woman of ill repute. So one of my questions is it possible that Kongza reacts the way he does to Zilu's acceptance of the rumors about her reputation because he doesn't think they're true? Is it possible that Kongza is aware that Nanza is the wife of Duke Ling of Wei, who is sympathetic and wise in the way that the text of Liang Yuhan later describes? That would make Analects 628 a little bit like Analects 5:1, in which Kongza gives his daughter in marriage to a man previously imprisoned for a crime that he didn't commit. Kongza would, in both cases, then be taking the side of truth and standing with the person who's innocent, even at the risk of his own reputation, which is especially striking in 5:1, since criminals were, of course, often tattooed on the face, and his son-in-law was likely permanently branded as a criminal, right? So he takes that burden onto his family and accepting him into his family. There are a number of other questions worth considering as well. Is Kongza's expression, "May Tian cast me aside," a serious oath in which he is swearing that he did nothing wrong? That would seem out of character and a bit odd for Kongza in response to a disciple. It's even more odd considering that Kongza regarded Zilu as overly resolute, bold, not restrained, right? This is Zilu's sort of set of challenges, right? A more compelling interpretation, I think, is that it's an expression of exasperation meant to communicate that he thinks it's ridiculous to imply that anything inappropriate happened. Given all of the emphasis that Kongza places on actions over words, it wouldn't be surprising for him to express frustration with Zilu for believing salacious rumors about Nanza and for not trusting his judgment about the situation. An added issue worth our consideration, alluded to by Gao Shiji, whom I mentioned a moment ago, is why Nanza is found blameworthy by the tradition when it seems that the worst approbation really should be reserved for her son by Confucian standards. For what we have here is a story of a son who tries to kill either his mother or his stepmother. If she's not his biological mother, then perhaps it becomes a little bit more comprehensible. But none of those details are clear. So he is by no standard filial. Why then is Nanza the immoral one who goes down in history? If we take the text of the Analects as a whole, as the commentarial tradition does, then when we go to consider what the text says about filial piety, it really seems like commentators are treating Nanza's story differently from other cases. I think that's important because although they tend to read passages in light of each other in different parts of the text, the one passage in which we have a significant female character stands alone, with commentators blaming a woman when her son was really far more blameworthy. And when we examine other passages in the Analects relating to parents and children, we have good reason to think that if Nanza had been a man, she would not have been regarded in that way. Okay. So I think, for example, one of the stories that it's interesting to think about Nanza's story alongside is the very well-known passage 13:18, which I also think is one of, as some of you know, I also think is one of the most widely misread passages in the text. So this is the passage where the Duke of Shi says to Kongza, "Among my people, there's one that we call Zhigong, the upright one. When his father stole a sheep, he reported him to the authorities, and Kongza replies, 'Among my people, those we consider upright are different from this.' fathers cover for their sons, sons cover for their fathers, uprightness is to be found in this. Upon an initial reading of that passage, it seems like Kongzi places parental loyalty over justice. But of course, there really is more going on. Kongzi and the Duke of Shi share a common sense of justice. They both know that stealing a sheep is wrong. What they disagree on is how to respond to it when it involves a person's father, your own father, right? Which is an odd set of circumstances. So the term used for stealing in classical Chinese isn't the same term that's used throughout the Analects for habitual stealing, robbery, or thievery. There are a whole bunch of, most of you know, there are a whole bunch of different terms for stealing under different circumstances. Jushi notes that distinct term that's used there, which indicates that the father had a reason for stealing, taking under some kind of duress. Leg notes that as well. We have a lot of good translators sort of on top of that. There's indicating that there are some extenuating circumstances around the taking of something that doesn't belong to you. If that's how we read the passage, it takes on a really different tone, right? So to not return a sheep that wanders onto your property is to fail to be wholly honest, but it's not the same crime as stealing. One who tries to turn his father in for that omission surely has an overly scrupulous sense of rightness. The term that's used for stealing wrong has the connotations of seizing or plundering rather than professional or habitual robbery or thievery. So Kongzi's response isn't necessarily the same response he would give to someone whose father was a thief or a robber habitually, but a response to someone whose father took something on a single occasion, apparently for a reason. And Kongzi is reacting to the fact that a son is praised and lifted up as a moral exemplar for having reported his father to the authorities, apparently without trying to resolve it with his father before reporting him. So if Jushi is correct in sort of that we should be attentive to that particular term in the original, then and we have a term referring to stealing when one has a reason, then the father might have stolen because he needed food, in which case the passage isn't really about whether it's just for fathers and sons to report one another's offenses. It's really about the fulfillment of filial responsibilities. Not only did the son not provide for his father in the sense of meeting his basic needs, he apparently alienated his father to the point where his father didn't feel like he could ask his son for assistance in dire straits. Even if one didn't feel responsible for what had happened, it would still be considered, I think, for most of us, callous to report one's parents to the authorities under such circumstances without even trying to work the situation out with them first. And if the upright one's father was in need, then his actions in reporting his father show a complete and utter lack of understanding of what his moral responsibilities were by Confucian standards. And I think by most of our standards today, or worse, an intentional neglect of his responsibility. If the son had covered for his father, he would have in fact been covering his own moral ineptitude by failing to care for his father as he should have. Okay, so we can see why Kongzi begins his response to the Duke of Shi with the words, among my people, right? Because this case looks like a foreign moral culture to him. Throughout the Analects, of course, Kongzi emphasizes that children should work to understand their parents' positions, regardless of whether or not they agree with their parents' actions. Children should gently remonstrate with their parents, but also be respectful, not oppose them. If we consider Kwai-Kwai's actions, Nanzi's son's actions against that backdrop in the Analects, it's puzzling that the tradition's worst approbation is reserved for his mother. If the son who fails to cover for his father when his father steals a sheep is neither upright nor filial, one would expect the son who attempts to kill his mother or stepmother would be viewed as worse. So why is Nanzi's reputation tarnished rather than his? Commentators and editors like Liu Xiang seem to have believed that she was the villain and painted her in that light, even though there appears to have been no basis for the claims that she committed slander or had an affair with her half-brother, and not enough basis for the claim that she committed adultery even. Those who were a part of the tradition that preserved Nanzi's story seem to have believed and sympathized with her son's version of events. So I think the question is it possible that Kongzi, unlike Zilu, recognized or at least suspected that there wasn't a basis for the rumors about Nanze? And is this why he had an audience with her? Why didn't this possibility occur to any of the commentators, right? Because they're pretty good, right? I mean, I'm a fan of reading the text alongside the commentarial tradition and the wide range of interpretations. I mean, as you guys know, they sort of go down all these rabbit holes, exploring all these potential interpretations. But that's not one that we see them engage. A really important clue regarding Nanze's true identity, I think, is seen in the Zuo Zhuan's claim that Duke Ling, quote, invited Song Qiao to his court to gratify his wife, end quote. So why would Duke Ling invite one of the best looking men in the land to court with the intention of his having an affair with his wife, right? This becomes the question. So if we look at the sources, I think there are lots of different possibilities that we can consider. The first concerns the fact that Nanze's husband, Duke Ling, is one of the earliest documented figures in Chinese history to be in a same-sex relationship. Duke Ling's relationship with the courtier Mizi Xia, which is documented in the Han Feizi, who was allowed to use his carriage without permission and whom he purportedly admires for giving him the remainder of a delicious peach, is the origin of the Chinese phrase in modern Chinese, yu tao, the bitten peach, a byword for male homosexuality. The tradition has long viewed the relationship between Duke Ling and Mizi Xia as an amorous one. And the claim that Duke Ling invited Song Qiao to his court to gratify his wife would actually make sense if Duke Ling were, in fact, in a same-sex relationship and desired to pacify his wife. Another possibility, which is not incompatible with the view I just suggested, attends to sources that suggest that Duke Ling did not adhere to traditional sexual mores. For instance, if it can be trusted as a source, and again, I think these are just all open questions, the Zhuangzi, which we know likes to poke fun at lots of people, right? The Zhuangzi states that Duke Ling would bathe in the same tub with all three of his wives. So if we assume that he enjoyed sexual relationships with multiple wives as well as men, then perhaps he also embraced the idea of inviting appealing men to enjoy relationships with his wives as well. Another important element of Duke Ling of Wei's story, as the sources present it, is that he was not a good ruler. So Analects 14:19 states that Duke Ling was an incompetent ruler who only remained in power because he had competent ministers. In 15:1, Analects 15:1, he certainly comes across as incompetent when he asks Kongza about tactical battle formations, to which Kongza replies that he has some experience with the arrangement for rituals, but not the arrangement of troops, right? So wrong question, right? With good reason, Englert and Patak hypothesized that Nanze may have had a hand in political affairs since her husband was incompetent. And that, of course, could explain why she would have requested meetings with figures such as Song Qiao and Kongza. Taking such meetings, of course, would have been viewed as highly inappropriate for a woman, which may help to explain why she developed a bad reputation, especially given that the culture tended to view women as temptresses. This view is certainly plausible. It's also possible that Nanze's reputation was tainted from the outset if her husband had a reputation as some kind of sexual deviant, right? Deviating from cultural norms sexually. It would have been intensified if she were meeting with men in order to manage political affairs for her husband, okay? If the favorable story in the Liang Nuzhuan then portrays the real Nanze, this would help to explain why Kongza had an audience with her. It would make her more like the women with whom Kongza had conversations. And there have been good discussions of that. Lisa Raffles especially has documented a lot of that. Her essay, A Woman Who Understood the Rights, is a great example of that body of literature. So if this is a case of mistaken identity, then that means that Nanze's story really bears a stunning resemblance to the story of Mary Magdalene in Christianity. So in the 6th century, Western Christianity began claiming that Mary Magdalene was a prostitute due to the popularity of stories about penitent whores, as the literature, this was how it was termed in the literature. And also, importantly, when Pope Gregory the Great conflated her with an anonymous sinful woman mentioned in the chapter prior to her introduction in the Gospel of Luke. Okay, so we're dealing with all these old sources here, like we're dealing with Nanza. The view became widespread, and artistic renderings reinforced that view of Mary Magdalene for centuries, yet there was absolutely no evidence to support the claim that she was a prostitute. It's certainly not found in any biblical references to her. Scholars now maintain that this claim was completely fabricated. To the contrary, it's likely that she was a woman of high social status, which allowed her to support Jesus and his other disciples, both spiritually and financially. As the truth about this came to light, in fact, Pope Francis elevated Mary Magdalene's memorial to a feast day in 2016 in a decree entitled the Apostle of the Apostles. He calls her, she was the apostle to the apostles. Okay, so this put her on a par with the liturgical celebrations of the male apostles. Okay, so you see an important move on the part of Pope Francis to rectify that mistake in the tradition. Women in both of these traditions then, both early on and as history progressed, were regularly marginalized and degraded by claims that they were sexual temptresses. All of the texts that reference their stories were written and controlled by men. Given the parallels between them and surveying all of the evidence, I think we have good reasons to question whether Nanza was, in fact, the woman of ill repute that the tradition paints her to be. There are a number of additional sources that support the view that Kongza's views on women were at least a bit more favorable than some of his contemporaries and followers. I think we kind of want to look at several different sources, and there's been some just wonderful scholarship done by a number of people looking at some of the stories that we have about his interactions with women. And we can talk more about those if you want. I do think when we go to think about that and Kongza's interactions, I mean, you think about the story of Jingjiang. Kongza praises her for admonishing her son, her knowledge of the rites, the girl of Agu. There are a number of stories that explore that. So I think, one of the things that we want to do is sort of balance our conclusions. So that we're not, being not going too far in one direction or another. Okay. Of course, none of these stories appear in the Analects. Those who have defended Kongza against charges of elitism have been keen to point out that he had poor students like Yan Hui, which suggests that he thought any man could practice self-cultivation. Those narratives show a more ambiguous record in the case of women. Okay, so while Kongza approves of their behavior and understanding in many cases, they're not his students. His remarks are addressed to his students, and the women in these stories are examples used for the purpose of instructing them. They are, however, I would say, positive examples, not negative ones. Lisa Raffles argues that propriety would not have prevented him from instructing women. And she notes that the Liji notwithstanding, Warring States texts show many cases of instruction, admonition, and argument between unrelated men and women. And Kongza shows no reticence in having Zigong speak directly with the girl at Agu in that story. So although the passages that we have to go on are few, as Lisa Raffles puts it, they do provide the uncomfortable suggestion that Kongza's views on human perfectibility and self-cultivation may have spanned social class, but not gender. We just see some different things. I'd like to offer another possible hypothesis there. I think we might begin by revisiting Raffles' keen observation that neither of those stories about women appears in the Analects. So assuming the stories were known when the Analects came together, it's reasonable to ask why. A related question is why the one passage depicting a woman in the Analects is the one about Nanza, who is presented in a wholly negative light in the Liang Yuhan and by commentators who accept that account. Yet the story itself in the Analects neither supports nor denies the view that Kongza believes Nanza is a woman of ill repute. The disciple he interacts with on this matter, Zilu, who is known for not being cautious and discerning in his judgments. Against that backdrop, I'm not sure that the stories of Jingjiang and the girl of Agu and their conversations with Confucius and his students represent an ambiguous case concerning the possibility of women's moral cultivation. To the contrary, I think that those two stories clearly express the view that he did believe women could be morally cultivated and could have a quite sophisticated understanding of the rights, an understanding that exceeds that of his disciples in some cases. Indeed, he uses them as positive examples to instruct his students, not negative ones. This also brings us back to our first point. Kong's disciples and their subsequent followers wrote and compiled the Analects. Perhaps they were hesitant to include these passages because they feared they might make them look inferior to these women, since the women are held up as exemplars for their instruction. I would further argue that the commentarial tradition, in its interpretation of the story of Kong's encounter with Nanzi, relies too heavily on unfounded and exaggerated rumors about her reputation. The passage itself looks more like a passage in which Kongzi is rejecting the view that her reputation poses any sort of problem for his interaction with her. So I think there's a reasonable argument to be made that in all of these cases, Kongzi rejects the view that women are wholly inferior. Perhaps what these passages suggest is that Kongzi consistently maintains that we must judge people for ourselves, concern ourselves with the cultivation of our own character and integrity more than that of others, and that women are capable of understanding the rights, of skill in argumentation, of how to navigate appropriate relationships in all of their variety and complexity. Indeed, based on his responses to Jingjiang and the girl of Agu, women are capable of mastering these things with the highest levels of sophistication. To be sure, early Confucian understandings of the distinct social roles for men and women and the rituals governing them imposed significant limitations upon both men and women. But for women, as we know, the restrictions were especially severe. Whereas at least some men had access to political power through positions in government and opportunities to become students of teachers like Kongzi, no women had those opportunities. Women were expected to obey their husbands in addition to their parents, but no early Confucian text suggests that men should obey their wives. Nevertheless, it is important not to confuse later Chinese ideas and practices with those of early China. As we've seen, the women in many of the stories and anecdotes from this period are confident and effective agents, celebrated for the remarkable influence that they had over their husbands and sons, daughters-in-law, over their society as well. Many of those women were educated about the rights and recognized for their intellectual and moral virtues, both. And those aspects of their stories represent a deep and important contrast to the abuses of women that were legitimated by a number of Neo-Confucian thinkers, most notably from the Chengju school. Yet it remains the case that many aspects of Confucian views and practices limited women's potential and placed them at a disadvantage. Particularly in light of all of that, as we kind of think about all these different sources, it's important to remember who played a role in deciding to include or exclude particular passages from the Analects. It's equally important to attend to who selected the Analects for a sort of canonical status, how it sort of rose to have a central place at different times in Confucian history. And I think we have to be attentive to the views relating to women and gender that those individuals expressed. So some of them, Dongzhongshu, Juxi, to name just a couple, made very explicit remarks about their views of women, derogatory views of women, really widely known. And that had a deep and lasting impact on Confucianism and the wider culture as well. So as Raffles pointed out, in Song Neo-Confucian texts and Ming illustrated editions of the Liang Zhuan, Jingjiang is presented very differently. As she points out, they portray her entirely as an exemplar of the gender system and completely de-emphasize her intellectual acumen and decisiveness. Juxi explicitly discusses her story as a model of separate spheres for men and women. The fact that the Analects excluded women as exemplars and included one woman from the commentarial tradition, included one woman whom the commentarial tradition held was of ill repute, Nanzi, would have been to its credit on their view. But we have some good reasons to be skeptical about this omission. So additionally, as I've argued today, I really think it's worth thinking across different traditions, different philosophical and religious traditions here. I think it's worth considering the case of Mary Magdalene in relation to the Bible. The falsity of the claim that she was a prostitute was not uncovered until very recently, and was accepted for centuries, not only by biblical commentators, but by Catholic and Protestant Christians around the world. Just as it would have seemed plausible and compelling to Christians that Jesus would have been forgiving toward a prostitute, it would have been plausible and compelling to Confucians that Kongzi might have gone to such great lengths as holding an audience with a woman of ill repute in order to follow the dictates of ritual, right? Those are faithful to Jesus's character on the one hand, faithful to Kongzi's character on the other. While we now know that the former was not true of Mary Magdalene, I think it's fair to ask whether we have an accurate representation of Nanzi and why the stories of other women in the Confucian tradition were not included in the Analects. I think it's also worth considering that Jesus and Kongzi, when we kind of put them alongside each other as exemplars in relation to this subject, are kind of interesting case studies. While many have believed that Jesus would have been going against the norms of his time by having women as apostles, there is evidence to suggest that the culture was more inclusive of women than the Christian tradition over time has led us to believe. And I always recommend to people the book, When Women Were Priests, Women's Leadership in the Early Church, and the scandal of their subordination and the rise of Christianity. So the gospel writers do not write Mary Magdalene's exceptional faith and devotion to Jesus out of the texts. Similarly, even though they were not disciples, Kongzi presents Jingjiang, the girl of Agu, as exemplars from whom his disciples could learn. In multiple sources, he praises their abilities as exceptional. This would not have been out of line with the early Confucian view that women could cultivate many, if not most, of the same virtues as men. So I think we should not be too quick to accept the claim that it would have been unthinkable for men such as Jesus or Kongzi to have regarded women in such ways. In both cases, the later traditions devalued women in ways that the earlier traditions did not. I want to thank you all, and I will hand it over to my conversation partners.
Thank you, Professor Cline, for such an engaging talk. I'm sure there are many follow-up questions right now. So I'll start by introducing our first commentator, Dr. Yuhan Liang, who is now a postdoctoral fellow at Wuhan University. She received her PhD in philosophy from the University of Connecticut, and her research focuses on ethics, Chinese philosophy, comparative philosophy, and she's particularly interested in Confucian virtue theory and virtue epistemology. Yuhan has published in both English and Chinese, so I'll just mention several articles. One of them is Commitment in the Rational Relativist Perspective and Zhi in Early Confucianism, the roles in moral cultivation, and Is there a universal priority in cases of value conflicts, reverse engineering Tuan. Dr. Liang also contributed to academic translation projects such as Chinese Cosmopolitanism with CITIC Press. And currently, she examines the role of moral exemplars, commitment, and personal style in Confucian ethics. She's also engaging in contemporary debates in virtue theory and also moral psychology. So, Dr. Yuhan Liang, looking forward to your comments.
Thanks, Agnė, and thanks, Professor Erin, for this great talk. I probably have some comments added on some questions, like small points. So in general, I do agree that maybe early Confucians is not as bad as later Confucians to discriminating women's and their possibility to be cultivated. But here, I still find like the conclusion might jump too quick. So even if like we accept that the Nanzi story might misrepresented and it's sort of projected later Confucius, their bad view towards women. But in the early Confucians, if we talk about like women's potential or their the possibility to be cultivated. It seems like we do not see any women exemplar, not only in the Analects, but also in the Mencius and Xunzi, right? Mencius is the one who gave this universal claim as everyone could be sage and everyone could be cultivated. But even though we didn't find like a single women exemplar or even like a moral worthy in the mentions, that's one thing, I guess, like its roots in a bigger background as maybe Confucius, as Roger Ames and Henry Roseman mentioned, like it's based on the roles, and maybe they didn't deny the possibility for women to be cultivated, but they sort of have this acquiescence, or they just take it as granted, like, oh, women should be assigned to certain role, and different gender and different roles sort of regulated by the rituals, so women should follow a different set of the rituals, not same as men. So they do not attend to the, for example, ancestor worship, and they have their own role to do. So it's still like not stereotypically deny their cultivation, but practically they have this different practice and inequalities. So that's maybe the first thing I want to point out. Like maybe we are getting too quick for women can be cultivated as they actually cultivated. And secondly, a related point to the Bible's example in the Mary Mullins case, I think Bible also, re-edited and, have a lot of different versions. It seems like if we have I remember, like, if we can take Mary Mullins as a female, I don't know, like relatively morally good women, it's kind of like changed the tradition, at least gave a approach or like a direction, like, it's still possible for women to be as good as men. But I don't know why, just in, like in parallel contracting with the Confucian tradition, it seems like we always have a different stereotype of women's exemplar in Confucian traditions. So I would like to hear your thoughts on this as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I mean, such great questions, such rich questions, right? I always feel like when we go to talk about women in early China, there are kind of these two, like, you're trying to balance between these two realities, right? So on the one hand, early Confucian sources do much better than, say, Aristotle, who of course is writing later than some of the earlier Confucian sources. Aristotle just says, none of this applies to women. Women are not moral agents, can't be moral agents. I mean, it is just full stop right there. Very explicit part of that tradition. Whereas you have early Confucian texts that are documenting how women embodied these virtues, and not just like these nurturing, mothering virtues, but also virtues like skill and argumentation, right? So in certain ways, they're very rich moral agents, right? And that's worth pointing out. On the other hand, that by no means means that they were even close to being equal. I always tell my students, right? Like I always say, like, I would never want to be a woman in early China, right? That is not to say that, right? It's not a good picture, right? I mean, you have a deeply patriarchal culture. Women are discriminated against in a host of different ways. And so I always feel like it's this sort of like, we have to try to balance, and give credit for some of the realities there and acknowledge the realities, while also balancing the very real injustices that were a part of the culture and women's lives. In the Christian tradition, of course, and I always think it's interesting to kind of look at biblical texts, because the methods that we use when we do text critical work on early Chinese texts, of course, were innovated by biblical scholars and then applied to Chinese texts. And so I do think it's interesting how we can learn from each other across different traditions. We now know historically that Jesus did have women disciples, right? They're not a part of some of the canonical texts, but we have really good historical evidence on that. And we also have good historical evidence on why those views like haven't been known in the tradition, right? And what happened. So I think that the Christian tradition provides an interesting sort of model for us in like, okay, you have centuries that pass with a prevailing view of this is just how it was, right? And those prevailing views, of course, live on for many people today who are Christians and work on Christianity. But we now have good scholarship that shows that wasn't the historical reality. But we also, of course, have limited, like in the Chinese tradition, we have limited textual sources to go on, right? So it becomes a complicated historical picture where we're trying to look at all the sources that we have, all the stories we have, trying to pay close attention to the characters and piece together what their stories seem to have been based on everything we know, right? That's the best we can do. This is what a lot of the scholarship on women in early Christianity has done. The early periods where women were priests, disciples like Mary Magdalene trying to rectify their stories. And I think like in the case of Nanzi, I mean, one of my goals is to show that there are a number of dimensions of her story and her husband's story, right? Because no one talks about the fact that Duke Ling was her husband. And there are all these stories associated with him and his sexual identity, right? So that's an important part of her narrative. And it's also, I think, faithful to the Confucian tradition for us to try to point that out, right? Because the Confucian tradition is just such a rich tradition to remind us how our identities are deeply shaped by and partly constituted by our relationships with other people. So you think of how Nanzi's own life and identity and experience and all the stories about her then are informed by who her husband was, who he might have been, what we know about him. Thank you so much. I'm so enjoying the conversation. Thank you so much for your wonderful questions and comments.
Thank you very much for this exchange. And now let's turn to the second commentator, Professor Wang, who is an assistant professor at the School of Chinese and research fellow at the Center on Contemporary China and the World, both positions taken at the University of Hong Kong. Her research interests include Confucianism, comparative philosophy, and Chinese intellectual history. She's particularly interested in Confucian feminism and how traditional Confucian virtues can be morally justified in modern China. She also co-authored the book with Daniel Bell called Just Hierarchy, Why Social Hierarchies Matter in China and the Rest of the World, which was published by Princeton University Press in 2020. And I think the book has been discussed in the四海为学 project as well. And Professor Pei is also a manuscript reviewer for Polity and has authored more than 30 articles, not only in English, Chinese, but also in French, and primarily focusing on Confucianism and comparative philosophy. And her work was also published in such journals as Philosophy and Social Criticism, China Review, Young Journal, among many others. So, Professor Wang Pei, please, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Professor Cline. I learned a lot from your talk, and basically, I agree. Basically, I agree with everything you talk about the Nanzi paragraph in the Analects, and I do feel it's quite creative to compare Analects with the Christian Bible, to regard Analects as a sacred text. That's very illuminating, and I just have a few humble points to make. And first is that I realize that the title of the talk is Women in Analects, and also it's a part of your book, Women in Analects. And you also mentioned that in early Confucian, the roles of mothers and the wives are super important. And we all know that because filial piety is not just towards father, but also towards mother. And sometimes mother can be quite powerful. But the point is, now we are doing Confucian feminism or doing Confucian and the female gender studies. We come across this problem. We talk about women in Confucianism, but sometimes the question shifted to mother in Confucianism. We'll say that, oh, mother has huge power in Confucianism, but no. If we really wanted to just talk about the women, in Confucianism seems like something quite different. I mean, because nowadays they're thinking about the implication for modern China if we wanted to reinterpret Confucianism for modern China for young girls in China. When we talk, if we told them that once you become a mother, you can be quite powerful in the family. I don't think that's quite desirable for all of them, but that's a very typical argument for Confucianism. I just would like to know about your opinion on that part, this women issue or a mother issue. And then another thing is about the women, the very famous sentence, women and petty persons are the hardest to look after, 难养. I kind of inspired by your method to regard Analects as a sacred text. So that I have a hypothesis of reinterpret this sentence that probably shows that it's only in Confucius his own embarrassment, or he felt it's not easy to do it in a nice way. It's hard. It's not just hard, but the hardest. Probably just show his own personal limits regarding to deal with women. But as long as his disciples choose this sentence to be one sentence regarding women in Analects, it becomes a kind of typical misogynist discrimination or normative guideline or something towards women. But probably in the very beginning, it can just show Confucius his personal issue dealing with women. Not very sure of my interpretation, so I just wanted to share it today with you to hear about your thoughts on that. And also the third one about not about the work you talk about today, but the other one you mentioned in your book, Virtues of Family, about we want now Confucian feminist scholars compare Confucianism with care ethics, and especially Ren, humaneness with care. I just felt so confused that only one point that if Ren is such a female like a virtue, why there was not even one female in Chinese in Confucian history be praised as a Ren person. And basically, Ren still a kind of male virtue, yes, in the Confucian development of Confucianism. That's my three questions. Thank you.
Yeah, so very, very, and I'm mindful of time here. Just a couple of points. Great. Thank you so much. These are great questions, right? And questions that I think we have to kind of keep exploring and talking about, and as we look at different sources and try to understand what we're looking at. I think when it comes to mothers and the sort of mixed views that you find, right? I mean, so like mothers are not just on an even footing with fathers, right? I mean, so there's that reality. On the other hand, you have very empowered stories about mothers. I mean, you have, like you mentioned, the text of the Mengzi, and then you have the stories about Mengzi's mother that are well known, where she's correcting him, not just as a child, but as an adult as well. So you see her as sort of this empowered agent. I think like one of the things that we certainly want to do is we want to work at rectifying the historical picture and being clear on what the historical picture was. So for me, that often means, helping people understand that there are a rich diversity of sources in Confucianism about women that say a lot of different things and coming from different periods that present them in different ways. And that some of the earlier sources are actually much better than some of the later sources, which always surprises people. So I think just sort of getting a firmer grasp on the historical picture, which is a part of what I'm trying to do with Nanzi in this paper. But I also think, we also have to be willing to say that we disagree with the tradition, right? And that they were wrong about certain things. And I think we should be willing to say, hey, here it is. And this is good that they did this. And it's better than Aristotle, right? But on the other hand, I think we also want to be willing to say, but it's not the view that we agree with, right? And where would we want to make amendments, right? So I think that's something we kind of have to be willing to do both of those things and not just one or the other. When it comes to Analects 1725, This is a passage that I translate a little bit differently, and I think it's significant in 725. So the way that I translate that passage, the master said, female and male servants are the most difficult to look after. If you're close to them, they're insubordinate. If you're distant from them, they're resentful, right? So the reason that I don't think it's women and petty persons is that Nudze refers, I think, to female servants or maids. I read Xiao Ren here as male servants because it's paired with the other term, right? So I do think that that's one of several passages in the text in my translation, as you'll see when it comes out, and I cluster them together and look at them together, that I think has been not sort of read in the way that it ought to be read. And again, my goal is definitely not to whitewash the tradition. But I do think we want to try to get it right. And I think that there are reasons within the tradition that a lot of those passages have been read in certain ways that are really derogatory toward women. So it becomes, again, a matter of, okay, how do we kind of uncover the truth, which I think is going to land somewhere in between some of the extremes, right? It's not the view that we want to just embrace and take off the shelf of women, but I think it's also not the same as some of the later views of women that deeply influenced commentators and translations of the Analects.
Thank you very much for the discussion. So we can continue to move on to the third commentator, Professor Dimitra Amarantidou, who teaches Chinese and comparative philosophy at the University of Macau. Her research focuses on irony, humor, and paradox in early Chinese thought, and she particularly focuses on early Confucianism. Her publications include The Irony of Confucius, Iharai and Confucius, a collaborative approach to feminist agency, The Riddle is Key, Irony and Paradox in 4 Contemporary Readings of Taoism, Translative Trends in 3 Modern Greek Renderings of the Tao Te Ching, among other articles as well. Professor Amarantidou also works on the translations of contemporary Chinese philosophical works, not only in English, but also in Greek. And she's also a fellow of the Center for Intercultural Learning at ECNU at Shanghai. And she's also an editor of the book review section for the Journal of Philosophy, East and West. So Professor Amarantidou, please, looking forward to your comments.
Thank you. Thank you, Agnė. I'm very happy to see you and Pepe also, even though online. Professor Cline, very nice to meet you. I don't know if I can call you Erin. I'm Dimitra. You can call me Dimitra. I had one point about 1725, but you already covered that. And my other point has to do with what you termed now, like just a moment ago, rectifying the historical picture, right? So it seems that, yeah, I'm trying to understand, like to frame somehow your project. It sounds like a very Confucian project of Zhengming, right? You want to rectify these names like Nanzi, right, and other female figures, and this is a very Confucian project. Of course, yeah, I wonder what it means, what it entails to rectify those names, right? And if we can, what did Kongzi mean when he talked about the rectification of the names, and if that had to do more about our attitudes, or cultivating our attitudes rather than correcting some reality out there, right? Like if everybody focused on cultivating their own attitude, right, then the names would be somehow rectified. And I'm very much interested in what you're doing with Mary Magdalene and Nanzi. I think this is a very interesting and philosophically rich comparison, let's say. So it seems that salvaging somehow Mary Magdalene, right, and salvaging Nanzi comes together with salvaging or revealing the true nature of their respective traditions. So that means that there is no real Christianity without Mary Magdalene as the apostle of apostles, in the same way that there is no real Confucianism without Nanzi as an exemplar, really, right? So I wonder, because I'm very interested in this idea of the true Confucianism, and also, of course, the true Confucius that emerges out of your reading or out of your salvaging of Nanzi, right? So I wonder if this quest for this true depiction, right, or this true tradition, or the true teaching that is somehow obscured by different, like, non-women friendly agendas, right? I wonder if this view somehow becomes exclusive of the possibility of some kind of a more pluralistic hermeneutic that allows for the different kinds of Kongzi. Like, for example, Gu Jiegang, right, the historian, says every 每个时代有自己的孔子, right? Has its own 孔子. Every era has its own 孔子. Every era has its own Confucianism also, right? Yes, I wonder if this somehow becomes an exclusive kind of framework that also does not recognize that the Analects itself, right, is a patchwork of opinions and a patchwork of, like, interests, preferences, and biases, right? So my question is more, if you like, more personal, if I'm allowed. Like, what is it that drives you into this quest? How do you find this philosophically compelling? This would be my question. And then I have a smaller one, a follow-up question, if there is time.
Great. Thank you so much. These are thank you so much. These are wonderful insights into the text. So I think, I am really animated by Rilke's claim that we should live the questions, right? So to me, a part of what we want to do when we open up a text like this is ask all these difficult questions, right? And consider from all these different angles, why is Kongzi frustrated with Zulu for saying this, right? And then, of course, that allows us to reach out to other texts and to kind of look more broadly at this tradition and these sources, which, of course, you can take this kind of text critical, kind of hard-nosed approach and cut them all. They're all different texts. They're all, or you can read them together as the tradition. And that also means looking at images from the tradition. It means looking at art and literary sources and lots of different things. So I think part of what we want to do is open up the wide range of questions and allow those questions to breathe life into how we read the text. And hopefully that also helps us to see these people as what they were, real people, right? So I think it's outrageous that no one has given attention to who Nanzi's husband was, right? And some of the very real elements of who he was that are so much a part of the Chinese tradition that you have this well-known phrase in modern Chinese that refers back to him, right? But to make the connection that that's Nanzi's husband, right? That's such an important piece of information that really ought to be informing the questions we ask about her in anywhere we encounter any element of her story. So I think that's a big part. That's one of the reasons that my talk today is reframing, right? I think a part of what we're really trying to do is kind of reframe and bring as many questions as we can to bear on the text, right? I do think that when it comes to Mary Magdalene's story, the Christian tradition is, of course, situated kind of differently, right? So in the Catholic tradition, you have a very clear leader in place. So Pope Francis had the authority, right? You don't have any analogous figure in Confucianism, but Pope Francis was able to say, look, she's the apostle of the apostles. And when he says that, he's referring to the fact that she's the first one to see the risen Christ, and then goes and tells the other disciples, right? Just really significant. So he's sort of, I mean, there's more of a rectification of the tradition because he's able to point back into the text and say, look, this is what happened. Don't forget this, right? And all this other stuff was a later, development and conflation with someone else and a lot of different things going on. So the Confucian tradition is situated differently, right? You don't have a central figure like the Pope who can say, hey, pay attention to this, and I'm going to elevate the feast day, right, in this way. But what we can do is try to reframe the story and remember the different people whose lives were intertwined and just how incredibly complex their lives were. Like, I'm sure, we have lots of discussions today of people, gender identity, sexual identity. But of course, these are things people experienced in earlier times in history. And it's so important to allow those elements of identities to animate our readings of texts.
Thank you very much. I don't know if I can follow up with a smaller question. Yes, because that's of course my particular interest. If I can be so self-centered, I'm interested in what kind of Kongzi emerges out of this reading, out of this. Who is your Kongzi? In other words.
So, I mean, my tendency is to read the text. I mean, you can certainly cut the text apart. We can take those last 5 books and what's going on there, right? We know that they're later. We know it's a different tone. But I try to read with the tradition, looking at the text as a whole and saying, like, who is this guy? And sort of like when I read the Gospels, I do read the Gospels and I'm thinking, who is this guy? Who is Jesus, right? Like, what's going on? I mean, and I think Kongzi similarly is very, very human, right? And so it's not a neat and tidy picture. He doesn't say all the things I wish that he would say, right? And so for me, it's always about walking a line between saying, okay, maybe he did. I mean, maybe he really viewed Nanza more charitably and was concerned about her people slandering her wrongly and putting all this weight on what people were saying. On the other hand, you also see just some of the realities of the culture. We can't expect him to be a man sort of out of his time, right? Holding progressive views. So it becomes a matter of trying to piece together, what do we see in the text? What is he saying? And why is he saying it, right? And of course, in a case like this, there are multiple reasons that he's going to be responding to Zilu the way that he does. So again, I think when we go to live the questions, when we're trying to figure out who someone like Kongzi is, it means we're going to be asking questions about, why does he say this or that? We're never going to be able to kind of bring it perfectly into focus. I see someone who's very human. I see someone who's very traditional in certain ways, and wanting to recover traditional rituals and get people to stop abandoning them. So conservative in that way, but also in a lot of ways, what we might call liberal or progressive, right? And that he's pushing back against his culture and a lot of received views and doing some kind of radical things. I mean, like taking as your son-in-law someone who had been, wrongly found to be guilty of a crime, and saying, look, this is wrong, this is unjust. And I'm willing to take it on myself and my family, right, in order for this to be fixed, right? It becomes very personal for him. So I think you see sort of both. I think you see both of those things. I think you see some things that are very forward thinking and surprising and pushing back against traditional views in his culture, and other things where he's looking further back at trying to move people in a more, what we would call more traditional direction, right? And especially with ritual. So I think it's mixed. I think it's very human. And I think it's messy and complicated, which I think is, it makes it more plausible, right? If it were a little bit too neat and tidy, then it would be like, this is all made up, right? This is not a real person, right? But I think the messiness really points to his humanity.
Thank you, Erin. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much for the exchange. And I think we still have some time to open up the discussion for the audience. So if anyone has a question, you may raise your hand or unmute yourself. If
Can I ask a short question?
Sure.
Just you mentioned the story of one in 列女传, the girl of Agu, and I felt quite confused reading that passage. That it's a quite innocent girl washing alongside the river, and why would Confucius wanted to test her by sending Zilu to her 3 times? Just wonder why would he wanted to know what the girl's virtue was. Just I quite I don't understand. I just it makes me feel a little bit strange. Just thinking about if it's a modern setting, someone came to ask a girl who had no idea of the quite a stranger setting, and people would view that as a kind of a little bit rude or no, like or strange. But I'm not sure why would this story was recorded in the 列女传. I would want to hear more from you, please.
Yeah, and I'm trying to think how I can sort of, so I mean, the girl of Agu, right? He praises her for exemplifying skill in argument. He sees this washerwoman on the road to Agu, tells Zigong that she's capable of good speech, capable with words, and suggesting that they can observe her intentions. Okay, so he gives Zigong a cup for water, a lute, which would have been to drive away the pigs, a linen cloth. A linen cloth was a betrothal gift. When Zigong asks her for water, she follows the rites by placing the cup on the ground instead of handing it directly to him. When asked to tune the lute, she claims not to know the 5 tones. And when he tries to woo her, she refuses him politely, right? So then the story concludes with Kongza describing her as penetrating about human affairs and understanding the rights, right? So, I mean, I think part of what you're seeing there is an example of a story. I mean, on the one hand, that story resonates with other stories like Kongza having Yan Hui as a student, being willing to engage people who are not just elites and praise people who are not just elites, indeed people who would have been really on the fringes of society. So you kind of see it reinforcing that. On the other hand, in that story, like some of the other stories about women, you see Kongza sort of in some ways offering the highest praise that he's going to give, which has to do with having an understanding of ritual propriety, right? So, you know, kind of one of the pieces that we want to add to our repertoire is we're kind of trying to figure out who he is, right? And what kinds of questions we want to ask about his identity. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. We're about time, but I still, if that's okay, would like to ask my question as well. So I find it very convincing and very interesting that you bring back this nonsense misinterpretation throughout the history. But I'm just wondering, what if she was, let's say, this complex character, and Kongza nevertheless wanted to go and meet her after all. So I'm wondering, maybe more power to her. Do we need to kind of purify her character necessarily to see her as this important female figure in Confucianism? So just something that I was thinking about. Thank you.
Yeah. And I think whoever she was, and I mean, we'll never know, right? I mean, that's, you know, we kind of have to work with the sources we have. Whoever she was, it's significant for all of us that Kongza has an audience with her, right? And so that allows us to ask a lot of questions about how we interact with others and how we treat others and what appropriate behavior looks like, which is not going to be cutting people off and not engaging them, right? Whatever else we say about it. One of my concerns has been that there were several pieces of her story that really have not been taken seriously and that have been marginalized and pushed to the fringes and just not aired, not looked at all. And I think there are really bad reasons for that, right? And so sort of, I want the truth, right? And I think in order to get closer, I mean, it becomes how close can we get? Well, I think in order to get as close as possible to the truth about who she is, I think we have to look at all, kind of hold all the different elements of the story open to the light, including who her husband was, and including questioning kind of the received view. Because again, like, I think there were a lot of agendas driving that received view. So that's sort of, where I'm at on that.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you, Professor Cline, for widening the questions, as you mentioned, and continue bringing back female figures to the Confucianism. And thank you for all the commentators. I think that there are no questions in the audience anymore, so I guess we can finish here. So thank you very much.